Hi everyone, today I wanted to talk about antibiotic resistant infections and what happens when someone has an infection and the antibiotics that they're prescribed stop working, and see what happens at a cellular level. So what these things are is, imagine someone has an infection, specifically a bacterial infection, not a virus infection. And when a person has a bacterial infection, they get prescribed an antibiotic. They take the antibiotic, but the antibiotic is not working. That could be an antibiotic resistant infection. So what you could see is persistent symptoms. The patient usually continues to feel sick. Symptoms like fever or pain or fatigue will keep going, and sometimes they even get worse, leading to significant illness in the patient. You also sometimes have multiple courses of antibiotics. So doctors might try different antibiotics, hoping to find one that works for the infection. This can mean multiple trips to the doctor, more prescriptions, and it's very hard on the patient, all these drugs, because these drugs also alter their good bacteria. There's also strong and more toxic medications. So if initial antibiotics fail, sometimes stronger and usually more toxic antibiotics are used. These can have severe side effects affecting the patient's overall health, their good bacteria, their digestive system, all of that. And there's also an increased risk of spread. So while the infection persists, there's a higher risk that the resistant bacteria will spread to other areas of the body, and this can lead to outbreaks of hard to treat infections, especially in hospitals when you have patients who have antibiotic resistant infections. So sometimes severe or persistent infections require hospitalization a lot of times. This is usually true if the infection spreads to the bloodstream, like sepsis, if it spreads to bones or other important areas. Hospital stays are hard because they increase the risk of acquiring these additional infections, and there can also be complications. So ongoing infections can lead to serious complications like organ damage, chronic pain, or long-term health problems from all the inflammation or whatever the infection is affecting. So the impact of resistant infections is a big deal, because once a bacteria becomes resistant, infections that were usually easier to treat with antibiotics that were treatable become much harder to manage. What happens is you see a longer illness duration. So resistant infections can persist for a long time because the standard antibiotics are no longer clearing the infection. And the reason why this is also bad is you're taking so much antibiotics. We have good bacteria in us, like in your gut and other areas, and those get affected. And sometimes patients feel nausea, they have constipation, they have pain in other areas. It just really affects your life. And then in women, it can lead to yeast infections. So this is why it's a serious thing. There's higher risk of infections. So when infections are harder to treat, there's a higher risk of complications, like the spread of infection to other parts of the body, like sepsis. This is probably one of the scariest things. So besides taking so many antibiotics, the infection, it can start as any infection and spread to other areas of the body. There can also be increased mortality rates in severe cases, especially in vulnerable populations like elderly or young children, or even immunocompromised people. Antibiotic resistant infections can be deadly. Examples of resistant infections are methicillin resistant Staphylococcus aureus, or MRSA. This is a type of bacterial infection, of Staphylococcus bacterial infection, that's resistant to many antibiotics. MRSA can cause serious skin infections. It can cause pneumonia, which is a lung infection. It can cause bloodstream infections, and it's hard to treat because it's resistant to methicillin, a class of antibiotic drugs. There's also multi-drug resistant tuberculosis. So tuberculosis is caused by bacteria, and this bacteria causes a really bad lung infection, tuberculosis. And this strain of bacteria does not respond to at least two of the most powerful anti-tuberculosis drugs, so it's pretty bad. There's also vancomycin resistant enterococcus. These are bacteria that are resistant to vancomycin, which is an antibiotic that's usually used to treat very serious infections. So this class of bacteria can cause infections in the urinary tract, in the bloodstream, in skin wounds, and others. And there's many other resistant bacteria. There's resistant E. coli, many others. the mechanisms of resistance, which is how do bacteria become resistant at the cellular level? What's going to the bacterial cell? So you have the bacteria in you, and let's say they're resistant. Things that they can do to make them more powerful or resistant is enzyme production. So some bacteria produce enzymes that can break down the antibiotic before it can do damage. A famous example of this is beta-lactamase, which is an enzyme that destroys the antibiotic penicillin by breaking its beta-lactam ring structure in the drug. There's also efflux pumps. So bacteria can develop these pumps which pump out the antibiotic. These pumps sit in the bacterial cell membrane, and they basically, when the antibiotic gets in, they pump it out before the antibiotic can reach its target inside the cell. And this obviously makes it harder for the antibiotic to accumulate in the bacterial cell to effective levels. There's also target modification. So antibiotics usually have a specific target in the bacterial cell. Bacteria can alter these targets so the antibiotic no longer fits or binds effectively to what it's supposed to target. So an example of this is, think of trying to insert a key into a lock that's been slightly changed. It doesn't work. There's also reduced permeability. Some bacteria can alter their cell walls to become less permeable to antibiotics. So antibiotics have to get in, and the bacteria can make it harder for the drug to enter the bacterial cell in the first place, which is a form of resistance. Finally, there's biofilm formation. Bacteria can form biofilms, which are these communities of bacteria, which are thick protective layers. And inside these biofilms, bacteria are shielded from our immune system, from our white blood cells, from antibiotics. And so biofilms are pretty tough to treat. So the way that we combat antibiotic resistance, things that we could do is to use antibiotics wisely. Only take antibiotics when they're prescribed by a doctor and when you have a bacterial infection, never for a viral infection. Always finish the full course of antibiotics, and always have good hygiene as one of them. But they are pretty tough, a big tough problem in healthcare.